Okay, it looks like the time here is 7:30, so we're going to get started with the webinar today. We're going to be talking about managing dry cows and longer dry periods. So we have Bruce Kelly, Program Manager with Farm Food Care, who's going to be moderating our questions at the end of the presentation. So if you want to give a hello, Bruce, to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
There you go.
We've got the question box open and the chat box open, so you can ask questions, I think, in both places.
Yeah. And I'm Marlene Pebamase, dairy specialist with OMAFRA. I'm going to be one of your presenters today. And we have Cynthia Miltenberg, who's lead veterinarian with OMAFRA, who's also going to be presenting today. You want to give a quick hello, Cynthia?
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so we're going to start first with some housekeeping. Much like an in-person presentation, we also have to provide housekeeping as well on webinars too. So questions are going to be answered at the end of the webinar, but as Bruce had said, you can put your questions and type them into the Q&A box, which is found at the bottom of your screen, or you can also put them in the chat. We're going to be monitoring both. If you are having some issues with seeing the slides, Bruce had sent the slides out ahead of time, so you do have a PDF version of them. Also, you can put that into the chat if you're having some major issues on that side. This presentation is being recorded, so it will be available on YouTube afterwards, so you can intake the webinar after. And a copy of the presentation you already have, but we also will be sending out an evaluation afterwards. So in this webinar, we're looking at managing dry cows for long and longer dry periods and some of the impacts of that. So long or extended dry periods is a dry period that is longer than what you currently manage for. So if you're currently managing for 50 days dry, you might be looking at extending that dry period to 60 or 70 days in the modern dairy, or even past that, maybe even up to 90 days. And this has really come into response of this of COVID-19 and the current situation that we're seeing within the food markets, where we're having a lot of volatility with supply and demand. And so we need to remain flexible through this period of time. It's really unpredictable in the markets. At the beginning of the month, we had the quota cut of 2%, and then an announcement of incentive days last week. So it can be hard as a manager to try and figure out how you're going to manage that. But this webinar is going to be useful for you if you've already dried some cows off early and how you're going to manage those cows. It'll also be useful for maybe in the future if you decide to dry cows off early in the coming months. It's all good information to have. So this webinar is going to cover selecting cows for early dry off and some considerations around that. We're going to look at best management practices for drying off and potential impacts of those longer dry day periods. So why consider drying cows off early? Well, it's really one part of a herd strategy for reducing production if that's what you need to do on your farm. It is a quick way to reduce production, so you're able to look at those later lactation cows and be able to dry them off and take that production out of the system. It allows you to maintain herd size, so you're able to maintain those cows for the next lactation and be able to have the benefits of that. It doesn't fiddle so much with the early lactation, which gives us the greatest economic potential of income over feed. And so we have a good opportunity here to be able to try and adjust according to that. Less complicated to manage, so you may be managing a few cows or a group of cows through this longer dry period and being able to monitor them more closely than maybe if you're doing herd level considerations. And it allows flexibility in response to a changing market. So like I had said, this is one part of our herd strategy. You might also be looking at culling cows at this period of time and potentially also looking at feeding more milk to calves. We do need to remember that the dry period is a sensitive time. So this graph here is showing fetal growth of a Holstein fetus for 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months. And you can see the large increase in fetal growth from 6 months to 9 months. And so this would be where we're looking at this extended dry period. This is the last trimester of gestation, a lot of rapid fetal growth and development. And so we don't want to impact that overly too much. When we're looking at close-up management at 3 weeks prior to calving, this is another very sensitive time. So if your close-up management is working well, suggested that you do not fiddle with that 3 weeks and instead look at extending that far-off dry period. But increasing far-off dry periods does come with increased risk of body condition score gain of these cows, and we'll be talking about that later in the presentation. So selecting cows for early dry-off really comes with 2 considerations: herd level considerations and individual cow considerations. From a herd level, there's a few questions that you'd want to be able to ask yourself when you're considering early dry-off as a way of reducing production. You want to look at your current production planning and what you're targeting for production. So this might be looking at your current inventories, how many cows you have calving in the next month, and the number of heifers that are calving, and looking at those expected calving dates to get a good assessment of when you're expecting peak milk production from cows. Also need to consider whether you have the facilities to be able to manage more dry cows. We will be talking about this in best management practices, but housing is a very important part in terms of transitioning cows successfully into the next lactation. You also want to consider how you're going to feed those additional cows in that dry cow group. And if you are looking at pasture as an option, you need to make sure that you're able to manage those cows on pasture effectively. And the last point here, you want to look at transition cow health. So what is the current status in the herd for kurtosis, DAs, metritis, milk fever? If you're already having some issues with transition period and transition period disease, then early dry off may not be an option for your herd. It's probably better to maintain that and look at other options for reducing production. Individual cow considerations come with two streams. So we're looking at cows for early dry off when trying to select those cows, and keeping in mind that not all cows may be eligible for drying off early. But you also might want to assess at this period of time in terms of what heifers are coming up to calve soon. And if there's cows that you might potentially cull and not breed back in their next lactation. It's always a good opportunity to review that and look at it from a herd improvement standpoint. So you want to look at the records, look at milk production, days in milk. You might look at a threshold where you say, I'm going to look at cows that are around this threshold of days in milk. It might be 200 days, and assessing where they're at in terms of milk production. Ranking based on income over feed. Sure, there's a lot of tools that are available to you through your nutritionist. There's also dairy comp cow value, which looks at income over feed costs, which can be used for ranking cows as well. Looking at that expected calving date to make sure that we're not extending that dry period longer than we think we are. And of course, looking at health records as well too of the previous lactation. If you have a cow that had a lot of trouble with coming through the previous transition period, she may not be eligible for early dry off, and it might be better to keep her on your current dry off program. We also want to look at the cow. So the key thing here that you're looking at is body condition score. We're looking for that optimal body condition score of 3 to 3.25 out of 5 at calving. So if you already have overconditioned cows and looking at early dry off, it might not work out so well in terms of trying to get those cows to transition successfully. And of course, there's a number of records that you can pull for looking at decisions and dry off procedures. Some of these will come up in Cynthia's part on best management practices, but somatic cell count, milk production records, and health records as well. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Cynthia.
Okay, thanks, Marlene. Now we're going to go through some best management practices for dry cows during this time, and we're going to start with housing. Our goal with housing is to reduce competition and improve bunk access, especially for subordinate animals, those that get lost around. We know that cattle are alliomimetic. Essentially means that they highly desire to do what their herd mates are doing, as well as being triggered by management things happening such as fresh feed delivery. So in order to allow cattle to do these activities together, we want to make sure we have enough space for them to lie down together and eat together. So for lying down, we would look at providing at least one stall per cow, or a minimum of 120 square feet if using a bedded pack, so everybody can lie down together. For bunk space, we'd be looking at 30 inches of bunk space per cow, so that everyone can eat when fresh feed is delivered, even the subordinate cows. Goes without saying that stalls should be clean and dry with ample bedding. And lastly, we really want to minimize stress. Each time new animals are added to the group, the social hierarchy must be reestablished, causing stress for all the animals. So ideally, to minimize this, we minimize the number of times per week that new cows are added to the group, or we can use stable, smaller groups that don't need cows added at all. Looking next at timing of dry cow management procedures, we want to, depending on the herd program, there may be a number of procedures or strategies that are in place. So we want to make sure that their timing is based on predicted calving dates still, even if the dry period is going to be longer, and traditionally you would have done some procedures at the time of dry off. A few examples that might be important for the herd here are hoof trimming, vaccines, feeding anionic salts or other supplements in the close-up period. We still want to target that timing properly based on the predicted calving date. One thing I want to spend a little bit of time on tonight is milk production at dry off. Cows now reach the end of lactation with higher levels of milk production for many reasons, among them genetic selection, improvements in our feeding and cow comfort, and certainly greater persistency of lactation. Attention to that production level may be even more critical if drying cows off early. We know that higher production at dry off is associated with increased risk of intramammary infections, and the reason for this is really multifactorial. Cows dried off producing more milk have increased intramammary pressure and are more likely to leak in the 24 to 48 hours after dry off. And this increases the risk for bacteria to enter the teat. And so the cows that leak are more likely to develop mastitis during the dry period. High production is also associated with the risk of failing to produce an effective keratin plug for teat end closure. And finally, lower milk production improves immune defenses, both at the local level of the udder and circulating systemically in the cow. So the question that naturally follows then is, how low is low enough? Looking at what research is available, there's some evidence from trials indicating where we might be starting to reach for. There's a study showing that cows producing more than 18 kilos per day are more likely to leak milk after they are dried off. There's another study done out of Guelph showing that cows producing over 21 kilos per day are at greater risk of having teat ends not closing and therefore developing mastitis. And a recent study from Ohio showed that cows producing more than 25 kilos per day had greater mammary engorgement compared to cows producing less than 15 kilos per day. Since milk production is highly variable, it will likely be very difficult to come up with a volume of milk as a goal that works in all herds and situations. But generally, it has been shown that reducing milk production before dry off protects against mastitis in the next lactation. And so finding ways to reduce milk production before the last milking is a good herd strategy to lower mastitis risk. I'm going to go through a couple of strategies that producers might be employing to reduce milk production. Reducing milking frequency is certainly one method that's used. Essentially, in this strategy, some milkings are missed before dry off, either every day or every other day, but most typically milking once per day from anywhere between 5 to 14 days ahead of the planned dry off date. Research in this area shows a range of results for the expected reduction, spanning 20 to 40% of milk yield. The amount reduced largely depends on what the starting level of production is, but typically about a third of production can be reduced by this strategy, going from 2 to 1 milkings per day. 2 to 1 milkings per day seems to be more successful than reducing from 3 to 2 milkings per day. When looking at high producing cows specifically, gradual reduction has been shown to reduce the amount of milk leaking and the length of time milk is leaking after dry off. Collectively, studies show either a reduced risk or no difference in risk of udder infections after a gradual dry off compared to an abrupt dry off. The decision to gradually or abruptly dry off cows really has to be informed by the specific herd, individual production levels, and the other strategies that are also being employed, as well as any other mastitis risks present in the herd. Another very common strategy employed is a diet change prior to dry off. By changing to a lower energy, lower protein diet, the synthesis of lactose is reduced, which in turn causes reduced milk production. The diet fed should be chosen carefully in consultation with the herd nutritionist to best use available feedstuffs and target the energy level. Some recent research done in Denmark examining cows on an ad libitum reduced energy diet ahead of dry off shows that these cows have high motivation to access feed, which they tested using a weighted gait and the amount of weight cows would move in order to access feed. And the researchers interpreted this as hunger. So this really emphasizes the importance of making sure the diet meets the target energy level. And finally, we always want to maintain access to fresh water, critical for the growing fetus as well as the cow. And then finally, moving groups. Moving groups can facilitate changing the diet easily, as well as a reduction in milking frequency if that is the plan for the herd. I just want to take a minute to address cull cows specifically. If choosing to cull cows from the herd, a similar dry off strategy can be used. So Canada's transport regulations do not permit loading or transporting an animal unless the animal is milked at intervals that are sufficient to prevent mammary engorgement. For cows being culled, we know the time to slaughter may be up to 7 days after leaving the farm. And therefore the level of milk production really must be addressed prior to shipping. And so about a week ahead of the planned transport, milking frequency can be reduced, feeding changed, and similarly moving pens can all be used to drop production and dry cows off. And with that, we'll take a look at feeding.
Yeah, so when we're looking at feeding dry cows, we're going to specifically look at this longer aspect. So when we're targeting for optimal body condition score, again, we're looking for that 3.25 out of 5 at calving. One thing that producers should look at is reviewing their formulated dry cow rations with their nutritionists at this time to make sure that they're able to meet that energy and protein requirement, as Cynthia had pointed out, pretty much as close to 100% as possible. We have to be cautious not to overfeed these animals, as the potential for them to gain body condition score through this extended dry period is more. But we also don't want to be underfeeding these cows as they're going through late gestation. So controlled energy, high fiber diets are still a good option here. What we're really looking at is changing that time in the far off period of time rather than increasing their time in the close up period. So they are spending more time in the far off dry cow period. One thing you can do that would be good at this point in time is to assess your straw inventory to just make sure that you have enough straw to be able to feed for those rations. We do need to reduce that competitive behavior. We want to make sure that these cows are able to get up and be able to feed when they want, to increase their dry matter intake at this time so that they're getting enough energy and enough protein. As we know that with the close-up period, we do have that drop in dry matter intake. Optimal particle size also goes with this as well to reduce sorting. So these far off dry cows, we want to be able to make sure that they're consistently getting the diet that is formulated for them. We are looking at pasture. There are a few things that we need to consider. So shade and water availability are going to be key, especially since we're coming up into the hotter time of year. This week is a good example of that, where we're seeing humid X's in 30 degrees. I think in the east it's up closer to 40 degrees. We need to make sure that we're offering that mineral supplement to those cows and think of how we're going to deliver that. And making sure that we're checking in daily with these cows as well to make sure that they're doing well. It's tempting to be able to put them to pasture and then look at bringing them up closer up to dry period, but we do need to make sure that they have everything that they need during this period of time. So if you have some questions about body condition score, there is an updated fact sheet on the OMAFRA website at publications.gov.on.ca. This is where this chart at the side here comes from. It allows you to be able to monitor your body condition score through that period of time, and has some good information in there. Dairy Farmers of Canada as well too has a very well put together body condition score guide as well. So now we're going to look at the potential impacts of longer dry periods. And Cynthia is going to take it away with looking at udder health.
Okay, so the udder is highly susceptible to new infections during both the transition from lactation to involution, and also from involution to colostrum production. There really is very limited evidence for udder health outcomes among cows with extended dry periods. The research that does exist is all from observational studies, typically examining many cow records from a production recording system similar to our DHI. Among the data that exists in those studies, there is a very weak trend for increased risk for a higher somatic cell count after calving, and increased risk of intramammary infections after calving. The connection is really not well established though, or necessarily applicable to our production systems. None of those studies are from North American systems. They come from New Zealand, Chile, France, and they all have differences in the management systems they're using. It's also important that these cows were not selected randomly to have a long dry cow period. They were selected by producers for early dry off, likely because they had low lactation persistency or low milk yield or other contributing factors or risks. So it really could be a lot of confounding in these types of studies too, or not even understood risk factors to explain these weak associations. We do, however, undoubtedly know that cows producing more milk at dry off have a higher somatic cell count in the following lactation, and this necessitates addressing the cow's production level prior to drying off. Regardless of dry period length, it's important to adhere to our other best management practices to prevent new infections. The risks are really likely herd dependent, and it's always worth a conversation with advisors to identify these, particularly if the number of dry cows are increased and there will be more pressure on the housing. The herd dry cow therapy protocol should be observed. For some, this will be a selective protocol. For others, it'll be a blanket protocol based on the herd risk and individual cow risk. Internal heat sealants can also be used to prevent introduction of bacteria. With these, it's really critical to use an aseptic insertion technique to avoid introducing bacteria into the udder. As well, proper removal is important to avoid having teat sealant in the marketed milk or in the milking equipment. And so the general procedure for this after calving, each teat should be stripped. Recommendations are about 10 to 12 times per teat. And this should be done at each milking for the first couple of days. Finally, it goes without saying that clean, dry housing is important to protect the udder from environmental mastitis bacteria. If the number of dry cows is increased, increased bedding and cleaning of the stall is going to be warranted.
So the next impact that might come to mind is what longer dry periods impact are on colostrum and milk production. So much like udder health, a lot of the studies in this realm are observational studies and trying to take into account a number of different factors across a large number of herds. So some of it can be taken, we can have some learnings from that, but we need to understand that there's a number of factors in play here. So the first part here, looking at colostrum quantity and quality, we know that dry period is important for the production of colostrum. And in this particular study, observational study, they were looking at a herd of Jerseys in the States that was having low colostrum yield for extended time. So they did an observational looking at 2,400 records of Jerseys coming into calf. Longer dry periods were significant in reducing, lowering colostrum yield in the study, but the impacts of that were small. So 75, 65 dry periods versus 45-day dry periods increased the odds of lower colostrum yield by 1.8, 1.69 for this particular herd that they were looking at. Another study that was looking at longer dry periods and its impact on IgG concentration, which is a one measure of quality of colostrum, observed no difference in IgG concentration. What they did observe is that you had lower colostrum yield from these particular herds, but that was associated with also the IgG concentration. So some recommendations here would be to monitor and track colostrum if you are looking at extending that dry period, making sure that you're feeding adequate protein in the dry off period, and maybe looking at storing more high quality colostrum in case you run into a period of time where you have more lower quality colostrum coming from cows. When we look at milk production, again, a vast majority of these studies are observational, and a lot of them are looking at the impacts of shorter dry periods rather than longer dry periods. And across all of the studies that we're able to look at longer dry periods for, they had differing definitions of a long dry period. So some were 70 days, and some of them were upwards of 100 days. So the range is quite big here. There are limited studies in this realm, but we do have a few that will give us some inclinations of what might happen with a longer dry period. So a number of these studies had shown that there was no to little impact on milk production and early lactation. Some of these studies looked at lactation up to 35 days, and they showed very little increase or decrease in milk production. Some showed no change in milk production between a longer and a shorter dry period. If we do look at next lactation, this is where we're going to see a bit more impact. So it seems like longer dry periods have more of an impact on persistency, but we have to keep in mind that because these are observational studies, it's more likely for a low producing cow in late lactation to be dried off early. So it's a confounding variable. What was interesting though is that the lactation impacts were greater for multi-parous cows than they were for premious parous cows. So the premious parous cows seem to fare well in their next lactation, whereas the multi-parous cows seem to have a large decrease in later lactation milk production. Decrease in lifetime milk production also goes with this as well. So with increasing number of days dry, we are having an increase in the number of non-productive days. And when you look at that, you do see a decrease in lifetime milk production for these increased dry periods. From one study in the States that was looking at DHI records across a number of herds, they did see that over 80 days dried was not advised, because then you're having a larger impact on lifetime milk production, probably to do more with looking at that persistency and the number of non-productive days. The last study I'm going to mention here was looking at milk production, and they were trying to take into account gestation length, which is what a lot of the previous studies had not taken into account when we're looking at dry period length and impact on milk production. What they found is that up to 35 days, there was no impact on milk production. So early lactation, there's no impact on milk production, but that overall lactation was decreased. So lactation milk production was decreased. They also found in terms of fat and protein content of the milk, fat seemed to be fairly unaffected by this increased dry period. But there was an impact to protein in both early lactation and as well into the later lactation as well. What they did conclude was that that the gestation length was not an impact in this case, but that these impacts in milk production were due to the management that these cows were going through with longer dry periods. And that might be for the fact that there could be some expected calving dates that maybe were miscalculated on that front, and so they maybe weren't managing these cows according to what they needed to be managed for with longer dry periods. So extended dry periods and body condition score. So we're going to see some challenges with maintaining optimal body condition score with these extended dry periods or longer dry periods. Again, the recommended body condition score at calving is 3 to 3.25 out of 5. And this slide here is showing us that cows have a preferred body condition score set point. So the graph is showing body condition score on the y-axis. We have weeks of calving across the x-axis, and the dotted line is showing calving. So the top line are overconditioned cows, our fat cows. The middle line is our moderate cows, so coming in at around 3.25. And the thin cows are the bottom line here. What we can take away from this graph is that the fat cows lost condition, and at 16 weeks came to body condition score, around body condition score 3. The moderate cows lost a little bit of body condition score. This is really only a quarter of a body condition score, and then settled at around 3 at 16 weeks. And those thin cows that were around the body condition score of 2 came up to body condition score 3 at 16 weeks. So, so looking at this, it seems like these cows have a preferred body condition set point. And if you want to read more about that, Drakely 2016, the proceedings from the Western Dairy Conference have a good lay of the land in terms of what we're looking at for body condition score. We do need to keep in mind as well that cows will preferentially put internal fat down first before we're actually able to see or observe an external body condition score change. So once we see a body condition score change, those cows have already laid some of that internal fat, which is going to predispose them to metabolic health challenges in the early lactation. And also loss of body condition score. So these fat cows coming down to body condition score 3 can really increase the number of issues that we have both in health, but also in fertility as well. And there is a lot of research that has looked at that over the years. When we think of metabolic health, we think thin and fat cows are at the greatest risk for disease through that transition period and for infertility as well. So we pulled some of the information on ketosis risk and dry period length. Again, there's not a lot of studies in this realm that specifically are looking at longer dry periods. So there is limited studies, but there are a few. So two studies that have taken place here in Canada. We're looking at ketosis risk through the transition period and associating that with different risk factors. What they found is that there was increased risk and increased BHBA concentration for cows that had dry periods of 56 to 72 days, and a greater risk was seen with dry periods that were over 72 days. And the next study that I'm going to talk about here is a controlled study. So they were actually designing this study to be able to look at 30 and 60-day dry off periods and comparing between those two. But they had a number of cows that were dried off early because of milk production. So they ended up with a group of 90-day dry period as well. So they included them into the study. So we had 58 cows. They looked at a lot of different measures, just focused on BHBA concentration. But the citations at the bottom here, Weber 2015, is where this particular graph comes from. And what we can see is that our cows that had 90-day dry periods, which are the white boxes on the graph, had increased BHB concentrations after calving. So these are days of calving at the bottom here. So you can see that those cows had high BHBA concentrations after calving. What I should note is that the average body condition score of this 90-day dry cow group was 3.75 at dry off, and it remained at 3.75 at calving. So overconditioned cows that were coming into calve and experienced a lot of metabolic issues there. Okay, Cynthia, if you want to wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks. So really just to wrap up what we've covered tonight, how we manage the dry period is important to future health in the next lactation. We want to review records, both the inventory of cows and heifers due to calve and our predicted production and the current transition health of the herd to decide if this is a good strategy, and individual cows to look at who are the best candidates for early dry off. We want to monitor cows closely through this period, particularly body condition score, to ensure cows are not going to be at additional risk during the transition cow period due to calving with a high body condition score. And finally, we want to manage milk production before dry off to reduce the risk of intramammary infections during the dry period and a elevated somatic cell count in the next lactation. And with that, thank you tonight for joining us.
Yeah, and we'd like to extend a thank you to Dairy Farmers of Ontario and the Ontario Agribusiness Association for promoting and supporting this event. Farm Food Care for hosting the webinar, and of course you the participants for making time to be with us here tonight. So with that, I'll pass it to Bruce to get us some questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got 6 questions lined up. The first one is any amendments for cows confirmed with twins?
Yeah.
You're jumping at that one.
Yeah. Any amendments for cows with twins?
Well, there is one thing we know, that gestation length tends to be a little shorter already for cows with twins compared to cows carrying a single calf. So we maybe want to account for that, and recognizing that cows carrying twins already have an increased risk for their disease for transition cow disease. So if a cow is confirmed with twins and that's known by the producer, I would take that into consideration when deciding if she's a good candidate for early dry off, and potentially she's not. Marlene, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered it there. Like, I think with twins, you're going to see more of that increase of demand of gestational growth. So I think what you've said there has covered it.
Okay, Roger's got another question. Are easy calving bulls really easy, or do you see a shift to 276-ish days rather than 282? And is 282 still the reference?
Yeah, so I think in terms of gestation lengths, I think the average of what I've seen recently has been around that 277 and 278 mark in some of the studies. And in terms of easy calving bulls, I don't currently have an answer for that question, but I can follow up with Roger afterwards.
Thank you. Another question from Roger. You referenced anionic salts. Do you have any comments about synthetic zeolite being used? Example, Axial.
Yeah, I could take that one. I think there is good evidence that zeolite can be a herd strategy to reduce milk fever and subclinical hypocalcemia. If you're using it, I still would just kind of the same recommendation as anionic salts. Feed it targeting your predicted calving date. So the close-up period.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Guy. Would there be any benefits to using the extra dry period time to consider longer and more intense therapies to treat, for example, confirmed Staph aureus mastitis for a second or third lactation cow, always under the supervision of a veterinarian?
Yeah, that's a bit of a tough one. I guess it depends on. It's going to depend on the individual herd and their goals with Staph aureus and current situation. Some veterinarians and producers might take that on. Probably you'd be looking at off-label treatments in that situation. So it really does need to be in the supervision or decision of the herd veterinarian that's going to be consulting on that. So yeah, I don't really have a go for it or don't do it answer. It's very herd dependent.
Okay, thank you. Mark's got a question. Body condition scoring for dry cow has less to do with the length of her dry period rather than her days of carrying a calf. There's no metabolic cost to a cow under 190 days of carrying a calf. In extended dry periods, a third lower energy group should be considered. I guess that's a question.
Yeah, Marlene and I talked a lot about the different scenarios people might be, extending dry cow periods here. It might be extending them for everybody by a little bit. It might be extending for select cows by a lot. And it's going to depend on the herd, on the space that they have, whether they can manage a separate group and diet. And for some herds that will be easy, and for other herds that will be more challenging. So I fully agree that a different diet could be fed and targeted for a specific group if the herd can manage that. Marlene, did you have anything? Marlene did a lot of work on the body condition score and length of dry and gestation.
Yeah, like I think there can be some benefits if you're looking at these really extended dry periods. So we're talking out to like 90 days or 100 days, where you have more time of that cow to potentially put on condition through that time period. It also depends on her body condition score coming into there as well. But yeah, I think you covered it, Cynthia, in terms of like it really depends on how much time we're talking about as that extended dry period and whether herds can manage it.
Okay, thank you. Danielle's got a question. Is there a brisket scoring system available and potential risk of fat mobilization?
I have not seen a brisket scoring out there. I know I also work in goats as well, so I know that with goats we do brisket scoring with them. I know Tom's on the line here. I don't know if you had found anything when you were updating body condition score fact sheet.
Yeah, no, I'm not aware of a brisket scoring system for dairy cows. If there is, I haven't seen it. I think for some of the work that you were showing, Marlene, I think some of that internal fat deposition is really just, it's a risk factor for metabolic diseases that relates to adipose deposition that we just can't see in body condition scoring. So it's one of those risk factors that is kind of a hidden factor, but I don't think we have a brisket scoring system to pick that up.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And Henry's got a question. What should the body score be for a first-time calver?
I'm guessing, we're looking for, again, around that 3 to 3.25 coming into calving. That's what I would see on that front.
Okay, thank you very much. There's one question in the chat session. Actually, it was proposed by me through someone who texted it to me. Would there be a difference in the management for a cow that has a 75-day dry period compared to a 90-day dry period?
So I think we kind of already covered some of that nutritional standpoint in terms of management. So with looking at these very long extended dry period days, getting out to 90 or 100 days, if there's the ability to, there might be some benefit of doing a separate diet for that group. It also depends on how many cows you have in that group. 75 days, the current average in Ontario is around 70. I think a majority of herds are around just under 60 if you're looking at it from a graph perspective. So that would be extending the dry period by about 2 weeks. So you may not have, the cow may not have as much potential there to lay more body condition score in that time. So so there might be some different management that you would take into place. What would you say from a udder health standpoint, Cynthia?
From another health standpoint, I really don't think there's too much difference. No matter what, we just need to address the milk production and prepare well for dry off, and make sure that we are reducing the risks for the dry cow period. If you have more cows at 90 days, that might have more pressure on the dry cow housing, and we might need to, approach that just because suddenly the stocking density has increased. But from a specific udder health standpoint, is there something different I would do with a cow? No.
Okay, thank you very much. So I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think we'll look to wrap this up. A couple of housekeeping items. Obviously, we want to thank Cynthia and Marlene for their great work on this topic and being subject matter experts. If you've got any more questions, their contact information is on the last slide. Send them away. I sent the PowerPoint deck to everyone just before the meeting started at about 7:20. So you have the deck for reference. We have recorded tonight's session and we'll send that link out. You can share the link and the PowerPoint deck with any friends or family that couldn't attend tonight's session. We're also going to send you a little evaluation form so you can tell us how we did and give us some suggestions for a future webinar. And on that topic, if you've got any other ideas that you'd like us to cover, we've got lots of knowledgeable people that we can draw on. And since we can't all get together during these times, this is a great format to have quick meetings. So I think with that, we will wrap up this evening's session. Thank you very much again to Cynthia, Marlene, and to Tom Tom Wright for being the spearhead behind getting this meeting organized. So thank you, everyone. Good night.